Welcome back to The Heat. U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis is in China for his first official visit after criticizing Beijing for the militarization of islands in the South China Sea. Mattis told reporters he's ready to listen and plans to discuss the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula and the role China can play. Well, let's bring in our panel to talk about that. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior researcher with the Pangoal Institution. Here in the studio is Christopher Young. He's the Donald Bren Chair of Non-Western Strategic Thought and the Director of East Asian Studies at the Marine Corps University. And Lester Munson is Vice President with BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Qinduo, let me start with you. Chinese relations with the United States are pretty fraught right now. As we heard, there's a trade dispute going on. Looking at Secretary Mattis's visit to China, what's on the agenda? What do you think this visit is going to achieve?
Well, I think, what's important for this trip is really about the communication. This is the first time for Secretary Mattis to be in China. Obviously, he said he will be a good listener to listen to the Chinese side about how to push forward the exchanges of the militaries between the two countries. So that's very important. I'm pretty sure he will present the U.S. case to the Chinese side in terms of North Korean situation, South China Sea, over Taiwan. And I think he will get a direct response from the Chinese side, either the military and also the Chinese top leader. I expect the meetings over there will be very meaningful. At least they have a direct understanding of what's the concern of the other side.
Christopher, when the United States talks about regional stability, regional security, and we look at this visit by Secretary Mattis, what does he hope to get out of this? What's the aim here?
What does Secretary Mattis hope to gain from the discussion? Well, usually for these types of discussions, I agree with the previous panelists' comments that communication is going to be a key. It's going to be a key point. And then also arriving at a common understanding of what security and stability means. Right. I mean, as we know, at least for the last 10 years, China and the United States have been disagreeing over what security, what good behavior in the South China Sea means, what security in the East Asia region means. And so coming to a common understanding is what Secretary Mattis is looking for and what I'm sure his counterpart in Beijing is looking for. And then, of course, obviously moving ahead on the Korean Peninsula is going to be a key issue, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in a few minutes.
Well, I want to talk about one of those issues that you mentioned, Christopher, and that is the South China Sea. This is what Secretary Mattis had to say. Let's watch.
There had been a promise in 2015 by the President Xi in the Rose Garden, the White House meeting, where he stated they would not be militarizing the Spratly Islands. We have seen in the last month they have done exactly that, moving weaponry in that was never there before. We are going out of our way to cooperate with Pacific nations. That's the way we do business in the world. But we are also going to confront what we believe is out of step with international law.
What do you make of that, out of step with international law?
Well, as the Secretary pointed out, President Xi did promise in direct consultation with the President that he was not going to militarize the South China Sea, the islands on the South China Sea. And along with most military experts, I would say that putting HQ-9 and YJ-12s, both with ranges above 100 and 200 miles does
these are missiles.
These are missiles. That's correct. Yeah. So I'm not in disagreement with the Secretary when he makes the argument that this is not in line with international law or good behavior. And so these are the kinds of things that the two countries are going to definitely need to get together with and discuss. Now, the Chinese perspective, which I'm sure your Chinese panelists will talk about, the Chinese perception of what they consider defensive. But the question is.
Well, let me ask him. Qinduo, what do you make of what you just heard?
Well, for the Chinese side, it's really the concern is, with this increasing frequency of the U.S. operation, freedom of navigation, U.S. warships and U.S. aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. The only target for the strengthening U.S. military presence in Asia, in Asia Pacific, let's say, is China. And then China, for itself, it sees like it's necessary for it to do something to increase its self-defense. Militarization is, you can argue, what is the definition of a militarization? For the Chinese side, they say this is necessary measures, steps they take to defend themselves, to defend the national interests and territorial integrity.
Lester, what do you make of Secretary Mattis' visit to China? Are these differences, perhaps misunderstandings, perhaps different ways of interpreting things? Can they be overcome, resolved? Can they get common ground here?
I don't think there's common ground on all of these issues, Anand. I suspect Secretary Mattis is there to deliver a very tough message. He will be very polite and respectful in public, but I think behind the scenes, he is delivering a very tough message to Beijing, not only on the South China Sea, but also on North Korea and other issues. There is no question in my mind that President Trump knows that China is the big issue at play in Washington right now. He's got Congress breathing down his neck, actually outflanking him to the right on a couple of these issues. So he's looking for Secretary Mattis to deliver a tough message to Beijing right now.
All right, Lester, that may be the intention, to deliver a tough message, but is there also a recognition on the U.S. side that these countries need to work together to resolve some of those issues?
Well, right. I think absolutely that's true. And I think in the grand scheme of things, there is a very vigorous and comprehensive dialogue between the two countries. The fact that Secretary Mattis is willing to go there and have these conversations and being very respectful in public is a very good thing. And the U.S. and China are the most important powers in the world right now. It is imperative that they get along in a peaceful way. That doesn't mean, though, that these issues should be given short shrift. There are real disagreements over security concerns in the South China Sea. Right. There are concerns of other countries in the region, such as Vietnam and the Philippines, that have to be accounted for, that China kind of glosses over. The U.S. would like to take those more seriously.
Qinduo, one issue where these two countries have been working together to some extent is the nuclear issue on the Korean peninsula, denuclearization of the peninsula. President Trump has met with Chairman Kim Jong-un of the DPRK. That was that meeting that took place in Singapore. And President Xi Jinping has said on this particular issue, he said that China will, quote, always play a constructive role. So on this particular meeting by the Secretary of Defense, what can we expect to come out of this?
Well, I think Secretary Mattis will hear from the Chinese side, like what's the Chinese plan, what's the Chinese idea to continue to push forward after the summit in Singapore in terms of denuclearization and, of course, exchange for the scaling down of the U.S. military presence in the Korean Peninsula. And we are seeing very positive steps taken by both sides, the U.S., South Korea, and the North Korean side. So we need to keep this momentum and to achieve something more substantial. I think China and the U.S. share a common goal. That is a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. This is also the goal shared by Japan, by South Korea, by Russia, and even by North Korea right now. It's really about how to build the confidence, how to build the trust between North Korea and the United States. So China is very helpful. China would like to play a very constructive role. China has played a very important role before the summit in Singapore, and I think China will continue to do so because that's also in Chinese interests.
Christopher, how important is trust in this relationship between the United States and China? Because, you know, we look at the United States now with this visit by Secretary Mattis, who says, look, we want to discuss security issues. We want to understand what's going on both sides. Yet, on the other hand, the U.S. withdrew its invitation to China to take part in those RIMPAC military naval exercises.
Right. So, so the question is, how important is trust to keep moving on? It's absolutely crucial. In particular, with regard to the North Korean issue, because right now the plan is largely one that Beijing has been largely arguing for quite a number of years. It's been the United States that has been resisting the freeze for freeze formula that Beijing has been putting forward. Now that you have a president who essentially has agreed with President Xi to move forward in that way, trust is going to be absolutely essential to move forward with regard to that Korean Peninsula agreement. Now, you asked the question with regard to what Secretary Mattis is going to be hoping for with regard to the Korean Peninsula. One of the things that the U.S. has consistently asked for is concrete measures to determine whether denuclearization is happening. And so Secretary Mattis is going to be talking with Beijing about getting Beijing's agreement on how do we determine that? How do we measure progress moving forward? And so trust, again, will be absolutely crucial in moving forward with regard to that process.
Right, Lester, that's pretty important, isn't it? How do we measure the success of this initiative by the President Trump, that is, to get rid of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula? So the United States says that it will keep sanctions in place for another year. President Trump has talked about the nuclear issue in the DPRK as being a national security threat. So is the U.S. here using a bit of a carrot and stick approach? I mean, what do you expect to be achieved?
Well, let's bear in mind the context here. There's an American election coming up in November. The president's majorities in both the House and the Senate are at stake. If it looks like he is making progress on the North Korea front, that it looks like we're on the road to denuclearization and a real change in the security aspect there, that's going to really help him and his party in the elections in November. That's definitely one of his goals. At the same time, Congress has drawn a red line for the president. They're not going to allow him to provide any sanctions relief for North Korea or in some ways for China until they see these real concrete steps that need to be taken towards denuclearization.
So looking at the visit by Secretary James Mattis, will he be looking at formulating some, looking at the nuts and bolts of what needs to be done there? There was that broad agreement that, at some point the DPRK would get rid of its nuclear weapons, the United States would lift sanctions, normalize relations with the DPRK. So is Secretary Mattis now looking at how progress is made?
Well, I think now we're in the very specific, detailed discussions of all the interested parties. Secretary Pompeo is getting ready to go back to North Korea to have further discussions there. Secretary Mattis is delivering important messages to the Chinese government. In Washington, the view is that North Korea is only going to go as far as China allows it to go in this agreement. So I think all of these things are working in concert together.
Right, Qinduo, one other issue, and that is Taiwan. How does Taiwan fit into what is going on between the United States and China?
Well, I think the Chinese side will express its a serious concern about, obviously, the strengthening ties between Washington and Taipei over there in terms of building like submarines and also the increase of the level of exchanges of officials between the two sides. So, there's whether Americans will send their soldiers to Taiwan for joint military exercise. That would be something unprecedented. I think there's a kind of like escalation of tension across the Taiwan Straits and also probably between China and the U.S. over Taiwan. I think that concern will be expressed to Secretary Mattis. Hopefully, at least a clear communication is necessary for both sides to understand on which point we are at the situation.
Christopher, could that be seen as provocation by the United States if U.S. military personnel get involved with the Taiwanese?
Would that be seen as provocation within China?
No, by China. Yes.
By China, yeah. Oh, certainly that would be something that would be considered an alarming move by the Chinese. On the other hand, the president and this administration seems to be set on moving forward with a closer relationship with Taiwan. So I would agree that some of the actions taking place with regard to Taiwan would be considered unprecedented by the Chinese, and certainly would be a red herring, or would certainly be a roll of a dice in terms of everything else going on. And so it's a puzzle to me that the administration would want to press on Taiwan as well as trying to move on North Korea as well as South China Sea. On the other hand, there are many within the administration and within the United States who cheer on the move to have closer relations with Taiwan. But it's a puzzle that the president would move on Taiwan, would seek to cooperate on the Korean Peninsula, and then have issues with the South China Sea. That's too broad of a front, in my opinion, to manage in your bilateral relations with China.
Right. And Lester, there seems to be a broader difference here that the United States, or a difference that the U.S. has with China. Just last week, Secretary Mattis was speaking here in the United States, and he said, I'm quoting here, he said that China, that is, has long-term designs to rewrite the existing global order. What does that tell us about U.S. fears about Chinese intentions?
Well, the U.S. is very concerned about free navigation in the Pacific and in really all of the waterways of the world. And right now, the U.S. has total dominance in that national security sphere, in the oceans and globally. China is a threat to that dominance. Maybe not today, but in the very near term, China presents a threat to the United States in that regard. So this dispute over the South China Seas is seen as a proxy for that kind of larger coming conflict, and I don't necessarily mean a military conflict, between the U.S. and China. And the way we resolve the concerns of all the nations in Southeast Asia over the South China Sea is going to be very indicative about the way forward on some of these larger issues.
Qinduo, what do you make of that? Does China see itself, is its intention to pose a threat to the United States?
No, China is not the enemy of the United States. China is not a rival of the United States. And China does not want to be a rival or competitor even to the United States. China does not have intention to replace the U.S. to be the predominant power in the world. No. The number one priority will always be domestic challenges in China. We have a large population, 1.4 billion people, a large country to deal with, to govern. So I think there's very important for the two sides to keep communication because to prevent, to avoid a misconception or misperception. For example, in the South China Sea issue here, there's never an issue of freedom of navigation in terms of business, in terms of the transportation of goods, because China is the largest trading nation. How China is going to affect the free navigation of goods, of shipping along this line? This is just impossible. And if you look at the South China Sea over the past 2 years, calm and stability have returned, have prevailed in this region. What is the problem? And the U.S. is sending more and more warships to this region. So if this militarization of this region, and China has to respond to protect itself. In this sense, you do see the tension over there. But of course, communication is always good for the two sides to understand each other here.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.